Imagine a long night at the heart of World War II. On June 6, 1944, while Allied forces were landing on the beaches of Normandy, another tragedy was quietly taking shape far from the thunder of the guns in southern France. Around the city of Montauban stood one of the most feared units of the Nazi war machine, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich. This was no ordinary military formation. Made up of men from Germany, Alsace, and other territories tied to the Reich, and led by officers hardened on the Eastern Front, it carried with it a brutal legacy of repression, ideological fanaticism, and organized violence. After months of fighting in the East, the division had been resting in southwestern France. But that rest was only temporary. Once the Allied landings began in Normandy, orders arrived for Das Reich to move north immediately and join the German response. On paper, this was simply an urgent military redeployment. In reality, the journey would become a deadly path through the French countryside, marked by sabotage, reprisals, and mass murder. The main obstacle facing Das Reich was not only distance, but the land it had to cross. The route to Normandy passed through regions where the French resistance was highly active, especially in the Limousin. For years, resistance groups linked to General de Gaulle, communist fighters, and British SOE agents had been preparing for this moment. They had stockpiled weapons, organized cells, planned demolitions, and studied the roads and railways. Their goal was not to destroy a powerful armored division outright, but to slow it down. In the context of D-Day, even a delay of a few hours could influence the larger battle. As the division began its march, the resistance launched attacks wherever it could. Roads were blocked with felled trees, railway tracks were sabotaged, bridges were damaged, and convoys were ambushed in wooded areas. Many of the resistance fighters were brave but inexperienced. Some were very young and poorly equipped. Coordination was not always perfect, and different factions sometimes acted separately rather than together. Even so, their operations had a real effect. Das Reich was forced to move through an atmosphere of uncertainty, tension, and growing fear. German soldiers understood that they were entering hostile territory. Every road might hide a mine, every bridge might be rigged, and every village might be helping the Maquis. Among the officers of Das Reich, that fear quickly turned into a doctrine of terror. In their view, every act of resistance justified overwhelming retaliation. The division did not simply fight armed opponents. It sought to terrify the civilian population and sever any connection between villagers and resistance fighters. Several important figures emerged during this period. On the Allied side, British-linked agents such as Violette Sabo, Philippe Lieuer, and Robert Maloubier were involved in supporting and coordinating resistance groups. On the French side, local leaders tried to unify organizations with different political loyalties and methods. But that cooperation remained fragile. Gaullists, communists, and British agents did not always trust one another or agree on strategy. While they tried to organize resistance, Das Reich kept moving. The division's command structure played a major role in what followed. Men such as Heinz Lammerding and officers like Adolf Diekmann had already served in the East, where warfare often included the execution of civilians and the destruction of entire communities. They brought that same mentality into France. To them, the difference between a partisan and a civilian was often meaningless. A suspicious village could be punished. A nearby ambush could justify collective murder. Their methods were shaped by ideology, vengeance, and habit. As the division advanced, violence spread from village to village. Men were arrested without clear proof, civilians were shot, homes were burned, and ordinary people were treated as possible accomplices. In many cases, suspicion alone was enough. Fear spread rapidly across the countryside. When people heard that Das Reich was approaching, some fled into the woods, others hid in silence, and entire villages seemed to stop breathing. One of the first major turning points came in the town of Tulle. Resistance fighters had briefly taken control of the town, which was a humiliating blow to German authority. When Das Reich retook Tulle, it imposed a deliberate spectacle of terror. Large numbers of men were rounded up, selected arbitrarily, and publicly hanged. The goal was not simply to punish immediate opponents. It was to shock the population, send a warning across the region, and prove that any challenge to German control would be answered with ruthless violence. The massacre at Tulle became one of the clearest symbols of the division's brutality. Yet something even worse was still to come. In the days that followed, the atmosphere became even darker. A German officer close to the division's leadership, Helmut Kampfe, had disappeared after resistance activity in the area. His disappearance fueled an obsession with revenge. Confused or exaggerated reports pointed suspicion toward a quiet village, Oradour-sur-Glane. The village was not a major resistance center. That is exactly what made what happened there so horrifying. The violence unleashed on Oradour was not the result of a battle, but of blind reprisal. On June 10, 1944, soldiers of Das Reich entered Oradour-sur-Glane and ordered the population to assemble in the village square. The inhabitants obeyed, believing it to be a routine inspection. Very quickly, the men were separated from the women and children. The men were taken to barns and outbuildings. The women and children were locked inside the church. The operation unfolded with chilling method and discipline, as if it had been planned step by step. Then the killing began. The men were machine-gunned, and many were burned in the buildings where they had been trapped. The women and children died in the burning church, caught inside in panic and smoke. When the soldiers left, Oradour-sur-Glane had become a landscape of ruins, ashes, and corpses. The massacre sent shockwaves through France. For many, it immediately became the ultimate symbol of Nazi barbarity on French soil. The few survivors carried the memory for the rest of their lives, and the destroyed village remained one of the most haunting physical reminders of the crime. Even after Oradour, Das Reich did not stop. The division resumed its movement north as though the destruction of an entire village were only one episode in a larger mission. But time had been lost. The resistance, through sabotage and disruption, had succeeded in delaying the division. And as Das Reich moved closer to Normandy, the nature of the war changed dramatically. In southwestern France, the division had been able to terrorize civilians and dominate smaller areas through force. In Normandy, it encountered something entirely different: the massive military power of the Allies. The skies belonged to British and American aircraft. Bombing, strafing, artillery fire, and constant pressure turned every road into a danger zone. Armored columns became easy targets, and movement itself became costly. By the time Das Reich reached the front, it was already worn down. It had lost time, fuel, equipment, and energy. Its men had endured days of strain, fear, and fighting. Yet German commanders still hoped that the division could help contain the Allied advance. The reality of the Norman battlefield shattered those hopes. Tanks were destroyed, columns were bombed, and units were broken apart. The feared elite division that had spread terror on its way north began to break under the weight of a modern, overwhelming battlefield. As the weeks passed, losses mounted. Younger recruits suffered heavily, lacking the experience of hardened veterans. But even the veterans could not reverse the balance. Das Reich, once a symbol of intimidation, became a division increasingly exhausted and battered by Allied air power and artillery. Some of its officers were killed, others wounded, and the hope of turning the tide through counterattack faded rapidly. The crisis deepened during the large Allied offensives of the summer of 1944. Massive bombing campaigns, coordinated assaults, and relentless pressure on German positions turned retreat into collapse. In the Falaise pocket, destruction reached an extreme level. Entire columns were smashed, vehicles abandoned, units isolated, and survivors struggled desperately to escape encirclement. What remained of Das Reich was no longer the force it had once been, but fragments of men trying to survive disaster. From that point on, the division was a shadow of its former self. Its name still carried fear, but militarily it had been broken. Remnants of the unit would continue to fight later in the war, but its real strength was gone. The road that had begun in Montauban and that had passed through sabotage, reprisals, hangings, and massacres ended in exhaustion, destruction, and the wider collapse of the German war effort in France. After the war, another painful question emerged: justice. France investigated the crimes committed at Tulle and Oradour-sur-Glane, but many of those responsible were never punished in proportion to what they had done. Some escaped trial, others benefited from political circumstances, and some received limited sentences. This failure of justice left a deep wound in collective memory. Tulle and Oradour-sur-Glane became far more than historical locations. They became symbols. Tulle came to represent public terror, humiliation, and exemplary violence used as a political weapon. Oradour came to symbolize the total destruction of an innocent village, the murder of men, women, and children, and the terrifying reality that ideological war can turn soldiers into systematic killers. The story of Das Reich's march toward Normandy is therefore much more than a military movement from southern France to the invasion front. It is the story of a division formed in extreme violence, challenged by a determined resistance, responding to every obstacle with brutality, and eventually being crushed by a larger war than it could control. It is also the story of civilians trapped between occupation, sabotage, reprisal, and massacre during one of the darkest moments in modern European history. That story leaves a lasting lesson. An army may advance with tanks, orders, and terror, but it can never fully control the moral consequences of its actions. Das Reich spread fear wherever it passed, yet it also left behind names that history would never forget. Tulle, Oradour-sur-Glane, and the many communities scarred forever by its violence.